lovely opportunity to be able to present some of the ideas, which I feel are very crucial for the period we are all in. I'm going to talk about possibilities of change, and we're going to look at a couple of things regarding, our times which we are in, and these are times of conflict. And so, how do we kind of survive these times of conflict? So, what are those possibilities of change? I mean, of course, it's a bit arbitrary notion that is change even possible, right? Um, but the last century has essentially been a century where a lot of things have happened, and we are in a period uh, where a lot of things have happened and are happening. So what are those things which are happening, and how do we kind of negotiate? How do we balance? How do we make sense of, sense of it, even if it appears to be senseless, meaningless, but nothing in this world is meaningless or senseless. So even discord, how can we have hope? Or even in period of conflict, can we have something totally opposite to it, and that is peace? How do we kind of do that? So when I say we are in times of conflict, I actually mean that we are in times of physical conflict. So a lot of things which are happening around is like we're in a world where there is a lot of religious discrimination, right? The world is actually going for war, right? In different portions of the world, there is war, and the, uh, sometimes, the major reason for these wars are these religious discriminations, right? There is patriarchal oppression, right? Misogyny seems to be increasing rather than decreasing. There are uh, there are riots based on ethnicity. Therefore, we look at identity crisis, we look at identity wars, identity discord, right? We've all gone through this period of the recent bio war, COVID-19. And when we look at, what has happened in the last from 2020 onwards, since COVID-19, our worlds have changed. And COVID is not yet over for us. It has become something which is a part of our lives. But the lockdown, and the kind of um, um, the way hunger has increased post-COVID, the world of diseases, not one but many kinds of viruses in the air. And how do we look at that period around us, and we are still in that period. We've not come out of it, so we are still in the midst of war in that sense. This is a period where a lot of movements have happened, right? And these movements, we've seen the movement regarding race in America, George Floyd movement. I come from India, so we had a CAA movement. There was a huge farmers' protest. There have been protests by women. In America, recently we saw anti-Israel movements within universities, right? Um, this is definitely a period of political upheavals, and we see physical wars between Ukraine and Russia, right? The Gaza-Israel war, siege of Afghanistan, and not to miss the natural famines, you know, floods in Dubai, for example. In India, at different places, there have been situations of flooding, drought, there have been landslides, there have been cyclones. And so if we look at, this period has been full of challenges. So what kind of a time, therefore, we are in? And when we talk of political upheavals, particularly, I would be talking mostly about political upheavals today and touching and not touching on the natural famines, for example. Um, so these are just kind of random thoughts, but these are thoughts which are being discussed amongst, academia and a lot of spaces, and they have been under discussion, under debate for some time now. So when we have this independent structure called nation, there is a question of sovereignty, and nations try to, exercise their power, but is it that in the name of power, the nations tend to exercise what we call absolute power? So the question is, like, are we facing the consequences of this independent structure of what we call nation, or is this the idea of sovereignty that has provided the nations with absolute power? And therefore, when in this period, or in any of the conflict, a dominating nation tries to subvert, the nation which is not as equipped or as powerful as the one which is dominating. And therefore, in the bid to preserve this power and to expand the influence of dominating institutions like religion, science, and technology, you see, last century, there was this bid amongst the nations to have nuclear weapons, right? And that won't be possible without science and technology. Or is it the capitalist endeavors, where nations become economically strong? And these particular factors, they determine why some of the nations are dominant nations, and while they try to have control over the weaker nations. So what are the means through which this happens? How does this actually happen? So sometimes, it is through the economic power, and sometimes it is through, you know, the the other power structures, right? In terms of kind of weapons which the some of these nations have. So economic, again, advancement, how advanced the nations are in terms of science and technology, right? So the bio war is a result of, advanced science. It couldn't happen there without the advanced science. But when this functions, right, it threatens, you know, the whole nation. And who are the stakeholders? Whom does this affect, right? So stakeholders are mostly the common people who are also the subjects of individual independent nations. And they may not even have their hands within what consequences of larger rulers or larger leadership, leadership's, idea of power is they have to kind of bear the consequences of what the leadership does. So the threat is to the common people. Children suffer, right? I'm going to talk about the war situation today, and then we're going to see how children, suffer, who have no, who have who are not participants in the conflicts, but they definitely bear the consequences. They are the stakeholders of the conflicts. So when the situation of conflict or threat arises, you know, is it also because of individualistic benefits, which perhaps certain leaders, are enjoying, or they want to have those benefits and retain their power. They don't want to give away that power. And in this bid to retain this power, you know, the conflict arises. And it becomes sometimes, a selfish motto or an individualistic benefit, because of which, there is a power conflict. There is a situation of conflict, and there is a compromise, you know, the peace of that particular nation is kind of compromised. Are leaders really answerable to the masses? Right? There are a lot of countries which are practicing democracy, for example, where people are central. But are they really answerable to the masses? Or even to the world for that matter? Is democracy practiced ideally in its true spirit? Right? We talk of principles of democracy, but the question is that is it really practiced in its true spirit? Does the common man, have that kind of a right? The common man being in center, the common people being in center, right? Children being in center, women being in center. Do they have those rights which democracy has really, promised them? So these are some of the questions which we need to visit, and we have questions. We may not have answers, but we're in the bid, to negotiate. We're in a bid to kind of have a certain kind of a balance. And how is that possible? Such, um, so the question out here is, if the situation is as grim that nations are thinking about their individualistic benefits, leaders are thinking about their individualistic benefits, right, then is peace even possible? You know, that's a question now. And the answer, I would say, is it is possible. I wouldn't say that it is not possible, right? But we'll have to negotiate peace. And how do we negotiate peace? We have to initiate a dialogue, you know, and the dialogue has to be initiated around the world. The world has to come together as a whole family, right? There has to be a third party intervention. We have bodies like UN, right? Um, International criminal courts, right? We have world level bodies that cater to global issues. The question is, are they really being able to have an impact? Right? Recently, we've seen a ICC court declaring, arrest for both Hamas leader and Israeli leader, right? But will that ever happen? You know, will that ever happen? How do we look at this whole concern of geopolitics? I mean, are these world level bodies even effective? In order to negotiate peace, in order to initiate dialogue, two things are very important. And one is the whole world needs to come together as a family. How will that be possible? The notion of the nation has to somewhere, you know, dilute down for this to happen. And it is not happening. The world is coming together as a whole family, right? When we look at, you know, um, the production of certain medicines, right? COVID, we saw, vaccine. I know vaccine itself is a very, very complicated issue. There have been there have been a lot of side effects of the vaccine itself. But the world did come together to procure the vaccine and to somewhere, have a control over this COVID situation and the world to function normally, right? Quote unquote for normally. Right. But the idea here is that the whole world will have to come together as a family. And the very idea, of the nation needs to be diluted for that matter. Now, what we see is there are major concerns, right? When the world comes together as a family, that it's not the notion of the nation alone, or the need of certain nations alone. There are concerns which are the world concerns. I've only taken around, 3 to 4 concerns over here, and those concerns are hunger and poverty. Hunger and poverty are not concerns of individual nations. They are world level concerns. They're concerns of every, nation. Environmental concerns are concerns of the world altogether. Human rights are concerns of the concern of the world altogether. If you look at environmental concerns, the way, the wars in Ukraine and Russia and Gaza and Israel, they are polluting, the environment. The whole world is going through a crisis. How do we stop that? Right? The use of sophisticated weaponry is emitting so much of pollution in the air. These are not concerns only of, these two nations, or, these are not concerns only of Gaza and Israel alone. These are not concerns of Ukraine and Russia alone, right? Rather, the peace of the whole world is being compromised with these conflicts. There are also these questions of human rights. When women suffer in one part of the world, it's not the women of that nation. When children suffer, it's not alone the children of that nation. This is a matter for the whole world, right? So we have to come together, as a whole family. The world has to come together as one. Literature has a very, very significant role to play here. Art, literature, because a lot of representation happens through literature. So art and literature, they've always offered a resolution to conflicts by suggesting self-introspection, by taking us back to history, by, keeping the consequences of the conflicts in front of us so that we can learn from those consequences. One wonderful, wonderful song, by Howard E. Rogers, which came out in 1918, when the flowers bloom on the no man's land. What a wonderful world that will be. So we need to dilute, the notions of even the borders, the boundaries, right? Because, the no man's land, which does not belong to anybody, right? If you have flowers there, and if you have lesser enmity between the two nations, it's going to be a wonderful day. And this is the power of music. This is the power of literature. This is the power of art. This is poetry, right? There are other means of representation too, and one of those means is, photographs, or it's also, um, how a narrative is derived from the photographs, right? And I'm also going to focus on a larger medium to represent and resist, and that is through digital spaces. So how digital spaces are enabling the world to come together. So when we talk of negotiating peace, and if we are considering how a world comes together as a family, right? It's not that it is impossible. It's already been possible, and digital spaces in a way are functioning to do that. And one of the very, very strongest examples of the world coming together, sharing with each other, is through technology, and is also through how, digital spaces are enabling, the whole kind of coming together, right? It has its own, drawbacks, but we're going to come to it in a minute. We're going to talk about the risks and opportunities of digital spaces. Before that, let us take a look at how photographs present a narrative. So where we started from, the times we are in, religious discrimination and patriarchal oppression. I'm not bringing cases from a world, which was in the past, but it is last 2-3 years now, right? I'm talking of times which we are living. So these are two pictures. One is a picture of, protests in India, in Bangalore, where women who were wearing hijab were not allowed to sit for exams. And so hijab is our right. On the other hand, the second picture is, a picture from Iran where there was a protest against hijab, right? The question here is not whether one should wear hijab or one shouldn't. The question here is, do women have the right to choose, right? And 2023, 20, when these protests happened, 22, 23, right? 21st century, and we are still, discussing, we are still fighting, we are still protesting for our rights. It's been more than 100 years that feminist movements have begun. But where are we actually? We need to introspect that. This was a book which was called Iranian Women Speak, and there have been a there has been a representation by the Iranian women, and I brought out this because particularly if you see this is anonymous, right? Where is it coming out from? Why hasn't the name been given? What kind of a picture is it? Right? And then the artist shares that my artwork is created by extracting my deepest emotions, providing myself and the subjects of my art release freedom from our confines. I try to show my deliverance to Iranian causes through every work of art. So we see, these are basically women, and you know, if you look at it, this picture has a double perspective. One is women in salwar with the dupattas, and the other is women with their bags, and wearing nothing, and holding each other, right? So this is the kind of representation that happens. Pictures have a lot to speak. We just look at these pictures and we see how a narrative is evolving, right? So there are weapons in this picture, there are people, and this is about Afghanistan seas. These are the Talibanis coming in to take on to Afghanistan. Israeli soldier detains a Palestinian boy in Hebron in occupied West Bank, right? What threat is this little boy to anybody at all, right? Look at the expressions of the boy in this, picture. I'm not analyzing them right now because otherwise it's going to take up my time, but I really wanted to bring these pictures to you so that they can be an initiation of the narrative. A small little boy, in the war situation, trying to pick toys perhaps from his broken house, whatever is left. Russia-Ukraine war, right? And one perspective is that, it's also a trial for the most sophisticated weaponry, a test for that. World literature today had collected narratives of, people who were in Ukraine and who had fled from Ukraine and who had witnessed the war situation. So these are from two of these people, two of the victims in Ukraine. Simeon Abramovich says, war enters my life and becomes a reality. The daily air raid sirens, the sound of air defense systems working, the deafening exposition of missiles. Life is divided in half into two parts, before and after. So those who are witnessing life, for them is before the war and after the war. War becomes, the demarcating factor. And Oleg Soslov, she says, bombings and missile strikes, multiple rocket launchers and the use of banned weapons, destruction of peaceful states, roads, bridges, factories, millions of people's forceful displacement, and death, death, death. All this on February 24. It takes years to build, cities. It takes years to build infrastructure. It takes years to build lives. And war disrupts it in no time. Right? And this comes from the actual life of what people were witnessing. Now, how do we negotiate peace in the midst of such kind of a conflict? And somewhere that's possible through digital spaces, because digital platforms offer great potential for broadly disseminating information and knowledge. And so, two things for any negotiation or any communication are important: information and knowledge, right? And digital spaces do enable that, right? It helps you explore ideas. It helps in shaping new modes of discourse. So discourse related to human rights, violence, and conflict needs to be initiated. Right? Some is already there. People are representing, but there has to be a more focused way where bodies who are the world bodies will have to come to negotiate. Digital spaces, enables one to connect to different constituencies. It allows creative modes of protest to emerge. So one is the physical protest that we see people coming on the roads and protesting, and the other is protest within the digital spaces. Whereas physical protest might be timed, you know, protests can go on forever. The nature of these protests, online movements, can change and can be remolded according to the times, right? The growing usage of digital media has transformed, impacted, and molded movements in the 21st century by spawning new forms of online and offline activism. For example, the feminist protests or feminist movements regarding, normalizing menstruation, normalizing the periods, have been ongoing on these digital spaces, and they've been more impactful than the physical protests, particularly on the question of menstruation. Digital spaces have initiated new dialogues and communication channels around the world. People have come together to, talk. Countries have come together to talk. Public has been able to voice concern. So no matter where in the world you are, but you do have a voice for something happening in Gaza, something happening, for example, in Ukraine, or something happening in Iran. So it has in a way initiated new dialogues. I do understand that there is also a control on these spaces. There is a control on the internet. There are internet shutdowns and all. But there are larger voices which surface, which put a kind of a pressure on the nations in this particular sense. What are the risks of digital spaces? One of the greatest risks of digital spaces is the false information. And in order to challenge this false information, we need to have aware consumers. And it won't be wrong to say that, even though there is a lot of fake information, on digital spaces, but over time, now all, cyber laws are in process. Also that people are becoming aware, the consumers are definitely becoming aware. And we have to check our sources from where any information is coming. So the news of conflict is reported through media. Media has a very, very crucial role to play for communicating the intention of the nations and communities. So whether it is a media on the digital space or it is, media on the physical space, media needs to play a very, very, sincere role, right? It has a very crucial role. It is important to create information ecosystem. This concept of information ecosystem comes from Nobel Prize winning Filipino journalist Maria Ressa. She recognizes the urgency in addressing information ecosystems, both for democracy and for the prevention of violent conflicts relevant to sustained peace. So information ecosystem needs to be created. There has to be a larger positivity in delivering information. Right? How can a negative piece of information be delivered sensibly? Dominant powers can control funding, internet access, shutdowns, use digitization for surveillances. So this is the risk, right? And the virus attacks are great risks, right? But once, cyber laws are properly enforced, right, or are properly in place, I mean, these risks would be minimized. What are the opportunities that digital spaces offer us? And digital spaces offer inclusive platforms. So opportunities are interaction of legacy media with digital media. Legacy media today also uses digital media. The question is how public inclusion is possible and effective for peace process. So where, while legacy media is a one-way process of imparting information, digital spaces have enabled two-way communication where public has a role to play. The public has a voice, right? So now it's a kind of a two-way communication. Digital spaces can be used to create awareness and aid in the process of peace building, right? So what information is to be delivered? So first idea of inclusivity is most important. Second idea, what information is to be delivered? How do we create information? How do we aid in the process of peace building? So how do we do that? How do we create awareness and aid in the process of peace building? Have a mechanism to verify information, whether fake or authentic. You know, if we see social media also has, uh, you know, um, a way, a process in which fake information can be reported, right? One can report against, messages which are offensive, which are fake, which are propagandist. So that's already there, but it's not sufficient. Much more needs to be done. We need to collect, analyze, and evaluate mass data and function with respect to the need of the hour. So, example, the rising disbelief regarding systems, right? So a very general belief that you have bodies like UN and ICC, but are they really, really impactful, right? When there's this kind of a rising belief, the intervention is required to create that kind of a belief system, right? Something very important, prevention is better than cure. Understand warnings. So digital spaces, can, if you have mass data, it can help you to understand warnings leading towards violent trends at a very, very initial stage. And it can be stopped there before it is too late. And then one needs to act accordingly in advance before everything is actually spoiled. I think this is where we are very, where the world is at a risk, because we are not decoding signs of warning. We are not trying to understand warnings. One needs to mediate between public and the institutions, right? Institutions sometimes exercise central powers, but digital spaces also allow you to mediate between public and the institutions. And once you have the mass data, right, and an analysis of that, one is able to mediate between the public and the institutions. Coming together of institutions working on humanitarian concerns, human rights, justice, and documenting human violation, and have a strong judicial system at the world level and not at the level of nations alone. Cyber laws will have to play a very, very important role. These are some of the thoughts, which I have brought together. And I sincerely hope that we enter a world, or we create a world for our future generations, which are very meaningful and which are spaces for creation and not for destruction, right? Where creative energy, in a way, has a very important role to play, right? And 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 how digital spaces in that way would lead to process of peace building. I would like to end on a message of hope, by the same um, piece of song which I had mentioned. When the sun shines through the clouds of war, and when peace covers all of the earth and sea, and when each mother's son has laid down his gun, what a wonderful day that will be. When the flowers bloom on no man's land, bringing a message of peace and love, and the cannon's roar is heard no more, what a blessing from above. Thank you.